Hey folks, we are continuing our discussion of the VLOOKUP function, and we're going to throw in another little trick called data validation as part of our exercise here. And what we're working on for this particular video is a second version of the concrete estimator that was introduced in the section on Excel basics. And again, in that section we were learning about relative versus absolute addressing and some basic formatting and so forth. But in this case we're going to set things up a little differently. Before, we had a price of concrete per cubic yard that was set up, and that's pretty much the same. We've moved it over to the right. It used to be at the top of this table, and we refer to that when we calculate the cost. It's the cubic yards times the price of concrete per cubic yard. And next we are going to calculate the cost of the rebar, the reinforcing bar, in each of these sections. And before, we just had a single price for rebar, but in reality rebar, the price is going to change as a function of the diameter. The rebar, it's a bar. It has a length and a diameter, and the amount of iron that has to be used in the rebar is a function clearly of its diameter, and that changes the price. And so instead of using the same price, we're going to look up the price as a function of the diameter using this table, using a lookup table. And we have a set of numbers here that are in ascending order, and they're sorted. And so you'd say, oh, that would be a range lookup where we find a value that falls within a certain range. And you could do that, but if you think about it, you're only going to be able to buy rebar in certain select sizes, and so we're going to expect this to be an exact lookup. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute, because we want to take steps to ensure that no matter what value, or that the values entered in this diameter column match what's in this table. But before we do that, let's go ahead and knock out this lookup function. So we're going to go to cell I6, and I'm going to type VLOOKUP, open paren. The lookup value is the cell just to the left, the diameter, and then the lookup table is this table right here, and I'm going to press F4 to make that an absolute address, because as we learned last time, typically the lookup value is relative and the table array is absolute address. And then we are going to put in a column index number. So that would be from which column do we want to return a value, and I'm going to put number 2 there. And then finally, do we want an exact match or an approximate match? And in this case, we want it to be an exact match, so we're going to enter false. And again, that last argument is optional, but you should always just type it in explicitly. And so there we go, 0.75, $1.60, that looks correct. And we'll copy that down, and we now have correct prices. Oh, excuse me, I've made a mistake here. I've put in the price, but what we really need is a cost. So we want to take this price we've looked up and multiply it by the length. So what we really want to do here is we want to say H6 times VLOOKUP. So I'm using VLOOKUP in a formula, in an expression, and it's going to look up a value, return that value, and multiply it by H6. So that's what we want here. So let me copy that down. There we go. Now we've got the correct totals, and I can do equals sum. This is the sum of the rebar, and do the same thing here, sum. I want to sum the concrete values, and then the structure total is equal to the concrete total plus the rebar total, whoops, $5,428. So that's great. Another simple example of how to use VLOOKUP. Very powerful tool. If your price has changed, all you have to do is update this table. Everything would be automatically updated. But now let's step back a minute and look at another issue here. What happens if I go in here and I type 0.3 or something that's not in the list? Well, I get an NA, which is an error message you get when it can't return a value. And so wouldn't it be nice if we could apply some limit so that the user is only allowed to input a number from this list of allowable diameters? And there's a way to do that. It's something called data validation. So I'm going to select all those cells, and I'm going to go to the data menu, and let's see, I need to whoops. Okay, sorry about that. I clicked on the wrong tab. So I'm in the data tab, and I want to click on this. In the data tools section, there's a option here called data validation, and if your window is sized a little larger, that will be explicitly spelled out, but it's the data validation option, and it brings up this menu. And by default, you're allowed to put any value in, but you can choose from this list what kind of restriction to apply. So if you put whole number, then it means you're going to input an integer, and you can give it a minimum and a maximum, or you can say not between, or equal to, or not equal to, and so forth. Or you can input a decimal, and a number of options. But what we want though is the list option, L-I-S-T. And it says, and once you select that, it allows you to input a source. And if I put my cursor there, and I go over here and I just select those diameters in column L, and it says equals $L $10 colon $L $14. So I'm giving it a reference to a set of cells that define the list of allowable values. Okay, and so I'm going to click OK, and now whenever I click on one of these cells, I get this little pull down thing on the side, and it shows me the list of available legal values I can choose from. And you can also just type something in. If I type 0.75, then everything's good, but if I go here and I type something that's not in the list, like 0.6, I get a message saying this value doesn't match the data validation restrictions defined for this cell, retry. And it won't let me get out of that cell until I've entered the correct value or revert back to the initial value. Now, by the way, that message that just came up, you can control that. If you go, I'm going to reselect those cells and bring up data validation. You can change the input message, so I can say, warning, you must input one of the diameters shown are from the list. Actually, this is not a warning, this is an error. So this is what happens. Oh, wait a minute, I'm getting my error, I'm getting my alerts mixed up. Let's go to the error alert first. I'll say, put the message there, type error. Now the input message, so there are two types of alerts here we can put up. One is a little pop-up that occurs when they select the cell. So I'm going to say, note, please select a legal diameter. Okay, and then the error alert, this is what happens when they ignore that message and they enter something that's not one of the legal values. And you can have it either do a stop sign or a warning sign or an information button. So we'll do a stop and click OK. So now, so notice that once you select a cell, it's gonna pop up that little yellow note and say, hey, you have to select a legal diameter. And then if you don't pick a legal diameter, let's do 0.6 again. It says error, you must input one of the diameters from the list. So I can cancel out of that. Now, me personally, I think this little note here is kind of annoying. So I like to just leave that blank. And then if I just get rid of those values. So now I've got, I mean, it's pretty obvious when you click on a cell that you've got this list of values to pick from. And then if I enter an incorrect value, I get my custom menu or my custom message box coming up. And that again is customizable. You can, instead of doing the stop, you can do the warning symbol. So now if I do 0.3, I get this nice little yellow symbol. And so that's kind of fun to play with. And bottom line is you can make it so that you guarantee you'll always get a match here because you're not going to let them enter anything but legal values from that list. So that is yet another example of using VLOOKUP, and then how to use input validation to ensure that you have a value you can look up from your list.